It began with a lingering sense of unease, nothing overt, just a subtle shift in the air. Caroline and I had been married for 15 years, and though our lives were far from perfect, they were ours. Together, we had built a life around our daughter, Emma, a spirited 14-year-old with a passion for music. She had a voice that could silence a room, and Caroline was her biggest champion, always finding ways to nurture her talent. I admired that about my wife, her devotion, her drive, the way she seemed to glow when she talked about Emma's future. But over time, I started to notice things, small, almost imperceptible cracks in the foundation of our family life. It wasn't one big moment, no lightning bolt of revelation. Instead, it was a series of tiny fractures. Caroline began staying up later than usual, her phone in hand as her fingers tapped out messages at a speed that seemed almost frantic. She laughed more often too, but not with me. It was a private laughter, shared with whoever was on the other side of that screen. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stresses of work were making me read too much into innocent things. But the knot in my stomach said otherwise. Our evenings used to be spent together, Caroline and I sitting on the couch, Emma practicing her songs in the background. Now Caroline seemed distant. She was there physically, but her mind was elsewhere. When I asked if everything was okay, she would smile, that tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and say, "Of course, why wouldn't it be?" It was a question that didn't invite further inquiry, so I left it alone. But the unease remained. Then came the vocal lessons. Caroline insisted Emma needed a professional coach if she was going to hone her talent. I agreed it was a logical step, and I wanted Emma to have every opportunity to shine. Caroline did all the research, eventually finding someone named Daniel. He came highly recommended, she said, a former performer with years of experience. She beamed as she described his credentials, and I remember thinking how much I loved seeing her so invested in Emma's dreams. The first time Daniel came to our home, I was struck by his presence. He was charismatic, the kind of man who could make everyone in a room feel like they were the center of his attention. He had an easy smile, the kind that made you want to trust him. Emma adored him immediately, and I could see why. He was encouraging, patient, and genuinely passionate about music. But there was something else. Something about the way Caroline's eyes lingered on him a little too long, or how her laughter seemed louder when he was around. I brushed it off. Caroline was just being friendly, I told myself. It was normal to be excited about someone who could help our daughter succeed. And yet, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. The lessons became a weekly routine. Every Wednesday evening, Daniel would come over, his guitar slung over his shoulder and a warm smile on his face. I tried to be present during the lessons, but Caroline always ushered me out, saying it would make Emma nervous. So I would retreat to my study, the sound of their voices, Emma's singing, Daniel's instructions, Caroline's laughter, drifting through the house like a haunting melody. One night, as I sat alone in my study, the unease I had been trying to suppress bubbled to the surface. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that Caroline would never betray me. She loved me, didn't she? But the more I tried to convince myself, the more the doubts crept in. Looking back, I wonder if part of me already knew. Maybe that's why I started coming home earlier, finding excuses to linger in the hallway outside the music room. I told myself it was to hear Emma sing, but the truth was, I wanted to know what was happening behind that closed door. I wanted to hear the way Daniel spoke to my wife, the way she responded to him. The changes in Caroline didn't stop at her newfound enthusiasm for Emma's lessons. She started dressing differently, nothing too drastic, just small changes. A new dress here, a pair of heels there. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said she just wanted to treat herself. I didn't question her. I didn't want to seem like an insecure husband, but I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. The late-night texts, the secret smiles, the way she seemed to light up whenever Daniel was around. It was as though she was slipping through my fingers, and I didn't know how to hold on. And so I did nothing. I buried my doubts, convinced myself I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. From the moment Daniel walked into our home, he commanded attention. He had a presence about him that was hard to ignore, an energy that seemed to fill the room, drawing everyone into his orbit. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about him. Maybe it was the confidence in his stride or the way his voice carried, low and smooth like a song waiting to be sung. Whatever it was, he made an impression, and he knew it. Emma adored him immediately. He had a knack for making her feel special, praising her talent in ways that felt genuine. He called her gifted, and told her she had a rare quality in her voice that couldn't be taught. It lit her up in a way that only someone who truly believed in her could manage. For that, I couldn't help but be grateful. He was helping my daughter find her confidence, her voice. But Daniel wasn't just good with Emma, he was good with everyone. He knew exactly what to say to make people like him, and he didn't waste the opportunity to charm Caroline either. From the first lesson, I noticed how easily they laughed together, how he seemed to speak to her as if they were equals. There was a light in her eyes when she spoke to him, a light I hadn't seen in years. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was nothing. Daniel was just a naturally charismatic guy. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Or was he? The first time I truly felt the stirrings of suspicion was during one of Emma's lessons. I had decided to stay in the room, curious to watch Daniel work. He didn't seem bothered by my presence. In fact, he greeted me warmly, as if we were old friends. But as the lesson went on, I couldn't help but notice the subtle ways he commanded attention. The way he leaned in just slightly when he spoke to Caroline, his arm brushing hers as he gestured toward Emma. The way his eyes lingered on her when she laughed at one of his jokes. It wasn't overt, not enough to accuse him of anything. But it was enough to plant a seed of doubt in my mind. After the lesson, Caroline was practically glowing. She couldn't stop talking about how talented Daniel was, how lucky we were to have him coaching Emma. I nodded along, trying to match her enthusiasm. But there was something about the way she said his name, soft and familiar, that made my chest tighten. I reminded myself that I had no reason to be jealous. Caroline loved me. She was my wife. Still, I started to notice more things. The way Caroline made sure the house was spotless before Daniel arrived. How she always seemed to pick out a new dress or do her hair a little differently on lesson days. It was subtle, barely noticeable, really, but it was enough to make me wonder. I began paying closer attention during their interactions, watching for signs of something I didn't want to see. Daniel had a way of making everyone feel like they were the only person in the room. He was attentive, engaging, and utterly disarming. When he looked at you, he really looked at you, as if nothing else in the world mattered. It was no wonder Emma thought the world of him. But the way he looked at Caroline was different. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. And Caroline, she responded to it. She leaned into his charm, laughing at his jokes, her eyes sparkling in a way that made my stomach churn. I told myself it was harmless. Daniel was our daughter's vocal coach, nothing more. But the way he made Caroline laugh, the way her posture changed when he was around, it felt intimate. One evening, after a particularly long lesson, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I couldn't make out the words, but their voices were low, conspiratorial, like they were sharing a secret. When I walked in, they both stopped mid-sentence, their smiles freezing on their faces. Caroline quickly changed the subject, asking if I wanted tea, but the moment lingered, heavy and awkward. From that point on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being excluded from something. Caroline and Daniel shared an ease that I hadn't seen in our marriage for years. It was like they were speaking a language I didn't understand, one I wasn't meant to understand. I started to resent the lessons. They felt less like a way to nurture Emma's talent and more like an excuse for Daniel to be in our home, to be near Caroline. I began finding reasons to stay in the room during lessons, watching them with an intensity that I hoped didn't show on my face. If they noticed, they didn't let on. Daniel remained his charming self, and Caroline, she seemed happier than she had in years. At first, I tried to ignore the nagging doubts in my mind. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But the more I watched, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. Daniel wasn't just Emma's vocal coach. He had become something else entirely, a presence in our home that I couldn't control, a shadow that lingered long after he left. Caroline would brush off my concerns whenever I tried to bring them up. "You're overthinking it," she'd say with a laugh, brushing my arm in that way she used to when we first started dating. "Daniel's just a good teacher. Emma loves him, and he's helping her so much. Can't you see that?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that Daniel was just a charismatic man with a passion for music, that Caroline's newfound energy was simply a result of her excitement for Emma's progress. But the unease wouldn't leave me. It sat in my chest, heavy and unrelenting, whispering the one thing I didn't want to hear. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what to do about it. The shift was slow, almost imperceptible at first. It started with the small things, subtle, fleeting moments that would have seemed insignificant if I hadn't already been on edge. Caroline began spending more time in the music room during Emma's lessons, sitting in on each session as if she were as much a student as Emma was. She would laugh at Daniel's jokes, her voice ringing out in a way that made me feel like an outsider in my own home. The space that used to belong to all of us, the three of us, felt as if it were shrinking, as though I no longer fit. Then there were the unexplained absences. Caroline had always been organized, her days structured around our family and her work at the local community center. But now her schedule seemed less predictable. "I'm meeting a friend for coffee," she'd say, or "I'm helping organize an event at the center." She'd toss the explanations over her shoulder as she left, her tone light and dismissive. But the excuses didn't line up. The timings felt odd, the reasons vague. Sometimes, she'd come home hours later than she said she would, her face glowing with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in years. When I asked about her day, she'd brush me off with a nonchalant wave of her hand and a vague, "Oh, it was fine." It wasn't just the absences that gnawed at me, though. It was the way she seemed more guarded, more private. Her phone, once a forgotten accessory left on the kitchen counter, was now always within arm's reach. She'd glance at it during dinner, a small smile playing on her lips as messages lit up the screen. When I asked who she was texting, she'd give me a name I didn't recognize. A new friend from the community center, a mom from Emma's school. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the knot in my stomach told me otherwise. The tension in the house grew, thick and suffocating. I started coming home earlier from work, hoping to catch a glimpse of what my wife's days looked like when I wasn't there. It was on one of these early returns that I saw them. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Emma's lesson was supposed to be wrapping up. I pulled into the driveway and noticed Daniel's car still parked outside. Nothing unusual, lessons often ran over. But as I stepped into the house, I heard voices, low and intimate, coming from the kitchen. Emma was nowhere to be found, likely in her room, but Caroline and Daniel were there, their heads close together over a cup of tea. I stood frozen in the hallway, just out of sight, my heart pounding in my chest. They weren't doing anything overtly inappropriate. It was just a conversation. But there was something about their posture, the way Daniel leaned in just slightly, the way Caroline tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she laughed softly, felt too close, too familiar. When I stepped into the kitchen, they both straightened up, their smiles faltering for a fraction of a second before Caroline plastered on her usual warm expression. "You're home early," she said, her voice light but tight, her eyes darting to Daniel as if seeking confirmation that everything was fine. Daniel greeted me with his usual easy charm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Surprise? Guilt? Couldn't tell. "Just wrapping up," he said, grabbing his guitar case. "Emma's doing great, really coming into her own." I nodded stiffly, my throat too tight to speak. Caroline walked him to the door, her hand brushing his arm as she thanked him. I followed, watching them closely, trying to decipher every glance, every word, every movement. When Daniel finally left, Caroline turned to me with an exasperated sigh. "What?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Like what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I just find it odd how comfortable you two seem." Her eyes narrowed, her expression shifting from exasperation to defensiveness. "He's Emma's coach. We're friends. Is that a crime? I wanted to press further, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. What was I accusing her of exactly? What evidence did I have? A glance here, a touch there? It wasn't enough. So I shook my head and walked away, the silence between us stretching like a chasm. Over the next few weeks, the unease only grew. Caroline's absences became more frequent, her explanations vaguer. I began noticing little things. Receipts for coffee shops she never mentioned visiting. A new perfume on her dresser that she claimed she bought, just because. I even found a scarf in the back seat of her car that I didn't recognize. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said it must belong to a friend. Then there were the phone calls. Late at night, after I'd gone to bed, I'd hear the faint hum of her voice from the living room. When I asked her about them, she waved it off as work-related or a quick chat with a friend. But she never offered any specifics, and I didn't push her. Not yet. I started piecing together small clues, connecting dots that I wasn't sure were meant to be connected. Every time I thought about confronting her, I stopped myself, afraid of what I might hear. I didn't want to be the jealous husband who saw betrayal where there was none. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from me. One evening, I decided to test my suspicions. Caroline had gone out again, this time saying she was meeting an old friend for dinner. After she left, I sat in my car, parked down the street, waiting. Hours passed, the streetlights casting long shadows as I stared at the clock on the dashboard. Finally, I saw her car pull into the driveway. She got out, looking flushed and happy, the kind of glow that didn't come from dinner with an old friend. When she walked into the house, I was waiting in the living room. "How was dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "Good. We had a lot to catch up on." Her lie hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I didn't press her, not yet, but in that moment I knew. Something was happening. Something that would change everything. The changes in Caroline weren't dramatic at first. Just little things like ripples on the surface of a pond. But those ripples soon grew into waves, and it became impossible to ignore how different she was. She began staying out later than usual, claiming she was running errands or catching up with a friend. The explanations were always plausible enough, but her tone carried a weight that made me feel like there was more she wasn't saying. It wasn't just her absences. Caroline's phone had become a near-constant companion, always within arm's reach. She would smile at her screen, typing quickly, and if I happened to glance her way, she'd lock the phone and set it face down on the table. When I asked about it, she'd wave me off, saying it was just group texts with her friends or something about Emma's school. I told myself not to read too much into it. After all, Caroline had never given me a reason to doubt her before. But the knot of unease in my chest only tightened. The shift in her behavior bled into our interactions as well. Conversations felt shorter, lighter, like she was holding back. When I asked how her day was, she'd give me a quick, distracted answer before changing the subject or walking away. She wasn't distant exactly, it was more like she was present in body but not in spirit. The connection we'd shared for years felt frayed, like a thread stretched too thin. And then there were the lessons. Daniel was now a fixture in our weekly routine, his visits becoming more frequent as Emma's passion for singing grew. Caroline was always the one to coordinate the schedule, and sometimes I felt like the lessons were more for her than for Emma. She would sit in on every session, her face alight with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in years. She would laugh at Daniel's jokes, her laughter carrying through the house, and sometimes I wondered if she even realized I was there. One Wednesday evening, I came home early from work, hoping to surprise them during the lesson. As I approached the music room, I could hear their voices. Emma's singing had stopped, and the conversation had turned to something else entirely. I stood outside the door, my hand hovering over the knob, listening. Daniel was speaking, his voice low and smooth. "You're incredible, you know that? I don't know how you do it all." Caroline laughed softly. "Oh, stop. You're just trying to flatter me." "I'm serious," he said. "You're different, in the best way." There was a pause, and then Caroline said, "Well, thank you." That means a lot. I stepped back, the air in my lungs suddenly too heavy. The words themselves were innocent enough, but the tone. There was something intimate about it, something that made my stomach churn. I didn't confront them. Instead, I walked back to my study, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the exchange playing over and over in my head. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining things? I wanted to believe that there was nothing going on, that Daniel's words were just harmless compliments. But deep down I knew better. The way Caroline had laughed, the way her voice had softened. It wasn't the way you spoke to a friend. It was the way you spoke to someone who made you feel special. The unease only grew in the days that followed. Caroline's absences became more frequent, and her explanations grew thinner. She started taking calls in another room, her voice hushed. When I asked who she was talking to, she would smile and say it was just a friend. But the smile never quite reached her eyes. I began to notice other things as well. She started wearing perfume again, the same one she used to wear when we were first dating. She bought new clothes, nothing extravagant, but enough to catch my attention. She started paying more attention to her appearance. Her makeup always flawless, her hair styled perfectly. When I commented on it, she brushed it off, saying she just wanted to feel good about herself. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I asked her point-blank, "Is everything okay?" She looked up from her plate, her fork paused mid-air. "Of course. Why would you ask that? You just seem different lately." She frowned, setting her fork down. "Different how?" "I don't know. You're out more. You're on your phone a lot. I feel like I barely see you." Caroline sighed, her expression shifting to something between irritation and exasperation. "I'm just busy, Alex. Between Emma's lessons, the house, and everything else, I don't have much time for myself. I thought you'd understand that." Her response stung, but I nodded, not wanting to press further. "Ido. I miss us." Her face softened then, and for a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen in love with. She reached across the table, her hand resting on mine. "I miss us too. I'll try to do better." But even as she said the words, there was a hollowness to them, a lack of conviction that made my chest ache. I wanted to believe her, but the unease remained, gnawing at me like a shadow I couldn't shake. As the weeks went on, I became hyper-aware of everything. I noticed the way Caroline's phone seemed to buzz more often, the way she always angled the screen away from me. I noticed the way her laughter with Daniel felt more intimate, more personal, as if they were sharing a joke meant only for them. And I noticed the way she seemed to light up whenever he was around, her smile brighter, her laughter freer. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers. But every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if I was seeing things that weren't there? The fear of shattering our family held me back, kept me in a state of agonizing limbo. But I couldn't stay silent forever. I knew that much. The tension was building, the unease growing stronger with each passing day. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The night I found the first message, everything changed. It wasn't that I had gone looking for it. In fact, I had promised myself that I wouldn't. There was a line I refused to cross, even as the doubt in my mind turned darker by the day. But it was there, waiting for me, as if it had been left out in the open intentionally. A tiny notification blinking on Caroline's phone, abandoned on the kitchen counter while she stepped away for a moment. I don't know what compelled me to pick it up. Maybe it was the months of growing suspicion, the way my chest tightened every time she laughed too freely with Daniel, or the nights she came home later and later with increasingly vague excuses. Maybe it was the way she had smiled at him during Emma's last lesson, her cheeks flushed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Whatever it was, I found myself standing over her phone, staring at the message. It wasn't from Daniel. Not directly, anyway. It was from someone listed only as AV. But the text was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. "Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about it. Can't wait to see you again." I locked the phone quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The message felt like a dagger buried deep in my chest, the words echoing in my mind. I could barely think, barely breathe. A dozen scenarios played out in my head, what it meant, who Evie might be, and why Caroline would have a message like that on her phone. When she returned to the kitchen moments later, I tried to act normal. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her pick up the phone, glance at the screen, and quickly tuck it into her pocket. She didn't notice me watching. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Either way, the moment passed, and she went about her evening as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't let it go. That message opened a floodgate of doubt and paranoia that I could no longer contain. Suddenly, every interaction, every word, every glance between Caroline and Daniel took on a new weight. I began replaying moments in my mind, analyzing every detail, searching for signs I might have missed. And the more I thought about it, the more everything seemed to fall into place. There were the whispered conversations in the kitchen after lessons. The way Caroline seemed to light up whenever Daniel was around. There was the sudden interest in her appearance. The way she spent hours getting ready for what should have been ordinary days. And then there were the absences, the errands that always seemed to take too long, the phone calls she took in private, her laughter muffled behind closed doors. It all fit together in a way that made my stomach churn. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that I didn't have enough evidence to accuse her of anything. But the doubt gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. I needed to know the truth no matter how much it hurt. That's when I decided to start paying closer attention. I began checking her phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through her messages and call logs in search of anything that might explain the growing distance between us. Most of it was innocent conversations with friends, reminders about Emma's school events, grocery lists. But every so often, I'd find something that didn't sit right. A text from an unknown number that simply read, "See you tomorrow." A late-night call that lasted nearly an hour, listed under a contact name I didn't recognize. Little things, but together they painted a picture I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just her phone either. I started watching her more closely, noting the way she moved, the way she spoke. There was a nervous energy to her now, a way she avoided my gaze when I asked about her day. She had become more protective of her privacy, her phone always locked, her laptop password protected. It was as if she knew I was starting to suspect something and was doing everything in her power to keep me from finding out. But it wasn't enough. The cracks were already showing, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. One evening, as I sat in my study, I decided to check the shared calendar we kept for Emma's lessons. It was a simple system, something Caroline had set up to keep track of the days Daniel was scheduled to come over. But as I scrolled through the entries, something caught my eye. There were extra dates. Days when Daniel was supposedly giving Emma private lessons at his studio. Days I hadn't been told about. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, the weight of it all crashing down on me. Caroline hadn't mentioned these lessons, and Emma had never brought them up. Had they even happened? Or was this just a cover for something else entirely? I didn't know what to think anymore. The woman I had loved for over a decade felt like a stranger, someone I could no longer trust. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed to be sure. The next day, I took a long lunch break from work and drove to Daniel's studio. It wasn't hard to find. Caroline had mentioned the address once in passing. I parked across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I stared at the building. It was small and unassuming, with a sign that read Daniel Marks Vocal Coaching above the door. I waited for over an hour, my heart pounding every time someone walked in or out. But there was no sign of Caroline, no sign of Emma, just Daniel going about his business as if nothing was out of the ordinary. By the time I left, I felt no closer to the truth than I had before. But the doubts remained, stronger than ever. The lies, the secrets, the unanswered questions. They were all building toward something. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The first real clue fell into my lap almost by accident. It was a Tuesday night, a quiet evening where the house seemed to exhale in stillness. Caroline had gone to bed early, claiming she wasn't feeling well, and Emma was in her room scrolling through her phone with headphones on. I had settled into the living room with my laptop, trying to finish some overdue work, when I noticed Caroline's phone sitting on the coffee table. It was unusual. Caroline was never far from her phone, always keeping it within arm's reach, like an extension of herself. I stared at it for a moment, a debate raging in my mind. I hated the idea of invading her privacy, but the weight of my suspicions pressed down on me. My chest tightened, and my hands grew clammy. What would I even find? Nothing, I told myself. There was nothing to find. But as I reached for the phone, I felt a jolt of nervous energy course through me. It wasn't locked, a detail that surprised me, and I swiped the screen to life. Her messages opened automatically, and there, at the very top of the list, was Daniel's name. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was probably nothing, that I would find a series of polite, professional messages about Emma's progress. But when I tapped the thread, what I found was something else entirely. Their messages were casual, full of jokes and inside references. Caroline's texts were littered with laughing emojis and playful responses, and Daniel's replies were equally light-hearted, but unmistakably flirtatious. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow, smiley face. You always make those lessons so much fun. Don't work too hard, Caroline. You deserve to relax. Winky face. My stomach sank as I scrolled further. There was nothing explicit, nothing I could definitively point to as proof of betrayal. But the tone, the way they spoke to each other, was intimate, far too intimate for comfort. Then, near the bottom of the thread, I saw a message that stopped me cold. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about it. I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. What did it mean? What had happened last night? My mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories. Caroline had come home late that evening, saying she had run into a friend from college and stayed out for drinks. I hadn't questioned it at the time, why would I? But now, those words on the screen painted a different picture, one I didn't want to see. The phone buzzed in my hand, startling me. A new message from Daniel appeared on the screen. Can't wait for tomorrow. You always know how to make me smile. Smiley face. I locked the phone and set it down as if it had burned me. My thoughts were a chaotic storm of anger, betrayal, and confusion. I wanted to storm upstairs, wake Caroline, and demand an explanation. But another part of me hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation for all of this? I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, my mind spinning in circles. Sleep was out of the question. I kept replaying every interaction I had witnessed between Caroline and Daniel, every laugh, every lingering glance. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and the picture they formed wasn't one I wanted to see. The next morning, I resolved to find more evidence before confronting her. I needed to be sure. I couldn't risk blowing up our marriage over a misunderstanding. I started paying closer attention to her behavior. I noted the way she always seemed to be in a rush when she left the house, how she smiled at her phone like it was a lifeline. I even followed her once, feeling like some pathetic private investigator. She had told me she was meeting a friend for coffee, but I watched from my car as she parked outside a small cafe and walked in, alone. Minutes later, Daniel arrived, greeting her with a hug that lingered just a little too long. They sat together in a corner booth, their heads close as they talked. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned toward him, her hand brushing his as she laughed. It was more than enough to confirm my worst fears. I stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every instinct in me screamed to go inside, to confront them right then and there. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to know the full extent of what was happening. Over the next few days, I combed through every shred of evidence I could find. Her phone, her emails, even the shared calendar we used for family events. I discovered more meetings that hadn't been mentioned, more excuses that didn't add up. I even found a receipt for a dinner at an upscale restaurant, one I hadn't been to. The more I uncovered, the harder it became to deny the truth. Caroline wasn't just growing distant. She was keeping secrets, and Daniel was at the center of it all. But despite all the evidence, I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. A part of me clung to the hope that I was wrong, that there was some logical explanation for everything. Another part of me feared the fallout, the questions, the accusations, the hurt. I wasn't sure I was ready to face what might come next. And so I waited. I watched. I gathered my evidence, knowing that sooner or later, the truth would come out. But as the days passed, the weight of the secret I was carrying began to crush me. I couldn't keep this up forever. The storm was building, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. The moment came on a rainy Thursday evening, one of those nights where the sky seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. The rain hammered against the windows, and the house was filled with an eerie quiet. Emma was upstairs, likely scrolling through her phone or watching videos, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath her feet. Caroline was in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner. Her hum drifted through the hallway, light and carefree, but it grated against my nerves. How could she hum so easily while I felt like I was suffocating? I had spent the entire day preparing for this moment. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Her denial, her anger, her tears. But nothing could truly prepare me for the confrontation that was about to unfold. I had reached my breaking point. There was no more room for doubt or delay. The evidence was there, and I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I walked into the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. She looked up when I entered, her smile faltering slightly when she saw the expression on my face. "Hey," she said, her tone cautious. "Everything okay?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself.
No, Caroline.
"Everything is not okay." She set down the dish she was holding, her brows knitting together in concern. "What's wrong? Did something happen?" "Yes," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Something has been happening for a while now, hasn't it?" Her confusion seemed genuine at first, but then I saw it, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, a fleeting moment where her guard slipped. She knew exactly what I was talking about. "Alex," she began, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. "Don't try to deny it. I know." She blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating. "I know about you and Daniel," I continued, my voice cracking on his name. "I've seen the messages. I've seen the way you look at him, the way you light up when he's around. I followed you, Caroline. I saw you with him at the cafe. You've been lying to me." Her face drained of color, and she took a step back, as if the distance between us could somehow lessen the weight of my accusations. "Alex, it's not what you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife is having an affair with our daughter's vocal coach. So go ahead, Caroline. Tell me what it really is." She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the messages, the dinners, the secrets, and that guilt was replaced with anger. "I trusted you," I said, my voice shaking. "For 15 years, I trusted you. I thought we were happy. I thought we were building something together. But now I see that was all a lie." "It wasn't a lie," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "Alex, please, you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this to happen." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and unfamiliar. "You never meant for it to happen? Is that supposed to make me feel better? Because it doesn't. It just makes me wonder how long you've been lying to me." Her tears spilled over then, streaming down her face as she clutched the edge of the counter for support. "It started out innocent," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear it did. Daniel was just... he listened. He made me feel seen in a way I haven't felt in so long." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Seen," I repeated, my voice hollow. "You think I don't see you, Caroline? You think I haven't spent the last 15 years trying to make you happy?" "It's not about you," she said, her voice rising. This was never about you, Alex. It's about me. I lost myself somewhere along the way. Between Emma and the house and everything else, I forgot who I was. And Daniel, he reminded me. I shook my head, disbelief coursing through me. So what? You decided to throw away our marriage because you were having an identity crisis. It wasn't like that, she said desperately. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice cold. You hurt me. You hurt Emma. And for what? A fling? A few stolen moments with a man who doesn't belong in our lives. She didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. I turned away, running a hand through my hair as I tried to steady myself. My emotions were a whirlwind. Anger, sadness, betrayal. I wanted to scream, to cry, to walk out the door and never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. We have a daughter, Caroline, I said finally, my voice low. A daughter who looks up to you, who trusts you. What do you think this will do to her? Caroline's sobs grew louder, and she sank to the floor, her head in her hands. I don't know, she said through her tears. I don't know how to fix this. I stared down at her, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. This was the woman I had loved for so long, the mother of my child. And now she was a stranger who had shattered our family. I don't think you can, I said quietly. Some things can't be fixed. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a moment, neither of us moved, the only sound the rain pounding against the windows. And then, slowly, I turned and walked away, leaving Caroline alone in the kitchen with her guilt and her tears. I spent the night in the guest room, though calling it sleep would have been a lie. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the storm outside mirroring the one inside me. Caroline's sobs had faded sometime in the night, replaced by an unbearable silence that felt heavier than her cries. My mind raced, caught in a loop of memories, questions, and bitter realizations. How long had this been going on? Had there been moments I'd missed? Opportunities to stop this before it spiraled so far out of control? When morning came, the house was eerily quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a gray, muted sky. I could hear Emma moving around upstairs, her footsteps light and carefree, oblivious to the wreckage below. I sat up, rubbing my temples, trying to figure out how I was going to get through the day. Caroline was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Emma's still asleep, she said softly, her voice hoarse. I nodded, grabbing a mug from the cupboard. The normalcy of the action felt surreal, like I was playing a part in a life that no longer belonged to me. We need to talk, she said after a long pause. I turned to face her, leaning against the counter with the coffee mug warming my hands. I think you said everything last night. No, I didn't, she said, shaking her head. Alex, her voice broke, and she took a shaky breath. I want to explain. I need you to understand. Understand what, Caroline? I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. That you threw away 15 years of marriage for some thrill? That you lied to me, to our daughter, for months. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice trembling. It was never about throwing anything away. I didn't mean for it to happen, Alex. I didn't wake up one day and decide to betray you. It happened. Don't give me that, I said, slamming the mug down on the counter. Things like this don't just happen. You made choices, Caroline. You chose to let him into our lives. You chose to whatever it is you've been doing with him. She flinched at my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. I know I hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. I know I've ruined everything. But please, Alex, don't let this destroy us. We can fix this. We can find a way back. I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. How, Caroline? How do you expect me to trust you again? To pretend like this didn't happen? Because I can't. I can't just erase the image of you and him out of my mind. Her tears came harder then, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I wanted to feel something, anger, pity, even love, but I was numb. The Caroline I had known, the woman I had built my life with, felt like a stranger now. The sound of Emma's footsteps broke the moment. Caroline wiped her face quickly, trying to compose herself as Emma entered the kitchen. "Morning," Emma said, yawning. She gave us a sleepy smile, completely unaware of the tension between us. "Morning, sweetheart," Caroline said, her voice too bright, too forced. I managed a nod, my stomach twisting at the thought of what this would do to her. Emma was the only reason I hadn't packed a bag and walked out the door. The days that followed were a blur of tension and avoidance. Caroline and I spoke only when necessary, our conversations stilted and full of unspoken words. At night, I stayed in the guest room, the distance between us growing wider with each passing day. Emma noticed, of course. She wasn't a child anymore. One evening, as I sat at the dining table pretending to review paperwork, she slid into the chair across from me. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. I looked up at her, my heart breaking at the worry in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "You and Mom," she said, fiddling with the hem of her sweatshirt. "You've been weird lately. You're not fighting, but it feels like something's wrong." I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "How do you explain to your teenage daughter that her family is falling apart?" "Sometimes grown-ups go through rough patches," I said finally, my voice strained. "But no matter what happens, Emma, we both love you. That will never change." Her brows knitted together, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is this about Daniel?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why would you say that?" She shrugged, her gaze dropping to the table. "I don't know. Mom just seems different when he's around, and I thought maybe—" Her voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. I reached across the table, placing a hand on hers. "Emma, this isn't something you need to worry about, okay? Just focus on your music, on school. Let me and Mom handle the rest." She nodded, but the doubt in her eyes lingered. Caroline and I eventually sat Emma down, carefully explaining that we were going through a rough time and might need some space. We didn't give her the details. How could we? But even with the truth hidden, the pain on her face was undeniable. I hated Caroline in that moment. I hated what she had done to our family, the cracks she had created in our daughter's world. But I hated myself too, for not seeing it sooner, for not being able to shield Emma from the fallout. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of our situation began to settle in. Caroline tried to make amends, offering apologies that felt hollow. She promised to end things with Daniel, to focus on rebuilding what we had lost. But the trust was gone, shattered into pieces too small to put back together. I knew what had to be done, even if the thought of it made my chest ache. This wasn't something we could fix. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too raw. For Emma's sake, I had to hold it together, but for myself, I had to let go. Telling friends and family was the part one had dreaded most. Until now, the chaos had been contained within the walls of our home, but I knew it couldn't stay that way forever. Secrets have a way of seeping out, and trying to act normal when everything felt anything but was exhausting. The truth had to come out. Not all of it, but enough to explain the shifts people were starting to notice. It began with Caroline's parents. They had always adored me, and the idea of explaining why their daughter and I were suddenly falling apart was unbearable. But I knew they deserved an explanation. So one evening, after Emma had gone to bed, I made the call. Her mother answered, cheerful as ever. "Alex, how are you?" I swallowed hard, gripping the phone like it was the only thing keeping me steady.
Linda.
I need to talk to you about something." Her tone immediately shifted, the warmth replaced by concern. "What's wrong? Is it Emma? Is everything okay?" "Emma's fine," I said quickly. "This is about Caroline and me. Things aren't okay, Linda." I could hear the confusion in her silence, the way she was piecing together the implications of my words. What do you mean? She asked, her voice quieter now. There's been an issue in our marriage, I said carefully, choosing my words as if they were shards of glass that might cut too deep. We're trying to work through it, but I don't know if we can. Her silence stretched, and I could feel her disappointment bleeding through the phone. Alex, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Have you two thought about counseling? Maybe if you talk to someone. We're considering it, I lied. There was no point in telling her the truth. Not yet. It wasn't my place to reveal Caroline's betrayal, and I wasn't ready to handle the fallout if I did. After the call, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the blank wall in front of me. The weight of what was happening felt heavier than ever. Caroline and I had built a life together, one that was intertwined with so many others. Untangling that life was going to be messy, painful, and public. When word began to spread, the reactions were mixed. Some friends reached out, offering support without prying. Others, however, couldn't resist the temptation to ask questions, their curiosity thinly veiled as concern. So, what's going on with you and Caroline? One of my colleagues asked over coffee. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, hungry for details. It's personal, I said, my voice curt. We're working through some things. He nodded, but the glint in his eyes told me he'd already added his own assumptions to the office gossip mill. I could almost hear the whispers. What happened? Did Alex do something? Or was it Caroline? Facing the world felt like standing in the middle of a courtroom, everyone around me acting as judge, jury, and executioner. But the hardest part wasn't the rumors or the prying questions. It was the pity, the way people tilted their heads and softened their voices when they spoke to me, as if I were a wounded animal they didn't know how to comfort. I hated it. Emma, on the other hand, was a different story. She wasn't asking questions outright, but I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. She was old enough to sense that something was wrong, but young enough that she didn't fully understand. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she finally spoke up. Dad, are you and Mom getting a divorce? The question hit me like a blow to the chest. I sat on the edge of her bed, struggling to find the right words. We haven't made any decisions yet, sweetheart, I said carefully. But no matter what happens, we both love you more than anything. That will never change. She stared at me for a long moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Is it because of Daniel? I froze, my pulse quickening. Why do you ask that? She shrugged, her voice quiet. I don't know. Mom's been weird about him. I see how she looks at him sometimes. And he looks at her the same way. The maturity of her observation startled me. I wanted to reassure her, to tell her she was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. Things are complicated right now, I said instead. But this isn't your fault, okay? You didn't do anything wrong. Emma nodded, but the worry in her eyes didn't fade. Caroline and I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Emma's sake, but it was a fragile illusion. Every interaction felt forced, every smile a performance. We barely spoke to each other unless it was about Emma or logistics. The tension was suffocating, and I could see it weighing on Emma, no matter how much we tried to shield her. At school drop-offs and pickups, the other parents started to notice. Caroline and I rarely arrived together anymore, and when we did, the space between us was obvious. The polite smiles and small talk we once shared with other parents now felt strained, like everyone was waiting for the moment when the cracks in our facade would become too big to ignore. One day, one of Emma's teachers pulled me aside after school. Mr. Turner, I just wanted to check in, she said, her tone kind but cautious. Emma seems a little distracted lately. She's such a bright student, but I've noticed she's been quieter than usual. My stomach twisted. I thanked her for her concern and promised to talk to Emma, but the guilt followed me home. No matter how much I tried to hold things together, the cracks were spreading. Through it all, Caroline and I kept up the pretense of working things out, but I could feel the distance between us growing. She apologized constantly, her words empty and repetitive. I'm so sorry, Alex. I never meant to hurt you. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. But no matter how many times she said it, I couldn't bring myself to believe her. The damage was done, and I wasn't sure I could ever forgive her. Facing the world was exhausting. The constant questions, the judgment, the pity, it all felt like too much. But the hardest part wasn't dealing with other people. It was facing myself. The man who had once prided himself on being a good husband, a good father, now felt like a failure. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow let this happen, that I had missed the warning signs until it was too late. The world was watching, waiting for the final act of our unraveling. And I knew that sooner or later, I would have to decide what that act would be. Caroline wanted to talk. She asked me one night after Emma had gone to bed, her voice trembling, as if she was afraid I'd refuse. "I need you to hear me out," she said, her eyes red and tired. "Please, Alex. I know I've hurt you, and I know you probably hate me, but I need you to know why it happened. I didn't hate her. Not entirely. But I didn't want to sit there and listen to her justify something that had broken me." Still, I nodded, more out of exhaustion than compassion. "Okay," I said quietly, sitting down across from her at the kitchen table. She hesitated, her fingers twisting together in her lap. For the first time in years, Caroline looked small, shrunken, as if guilt had hollowed her out. The confidence, the spark that had always defined her, was gone. "I don't know where to start," she said after a long silence. "I don't even know if you'll believe me." I crossed my arms, leaning back in my chair. "Try me." She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if steadying herself. "It wasn't about him," she said finally. "It was never really about Daniel. He was just there. And he saw me." I frowned, her words cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Saw you? What does that even mean, Caroline?" She looked up at me then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "It means I felt invisible, Alex. For years. It's like somewhere along the way, I stopped being Caroline. I became Emma's mom, your wife, the woman who keeps the house running. But me, the person I used to be, she disappeared, and I didn't even realize it until it was too late." I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. "And you think I didn't feel the same way? Do you think I didn't sacrifice, didn't lose parts of myself for this family? That's what we signed up for, Caroline. That's what marriage is." Her voice cracked as she replied, "But I didn't know how to find myself again. And then Daniel came along and he made me feel noticed, alive, like I mattered." The words felt like acid on my skin, burning deep into my chest. "So what?" I said, my voice rising. "You decided to throw away everything we built because someone gave you attention? Because you needed validation?" "It wasn't that simple," she said, tears spilling over now. "I never wanted to hurt you, Alex. I never wanted this to happen. I didn't plan it." "Then why didn't you stop it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you put our family first?" Her shoulders sagged, and she looked down at the table, her hands trembling. "Because I was selfish, because I was lost, and because I was weak." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to let out all the anger and hurt that had been festering inside me for weeks. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, despite everything, just felt sad. Sad for her, sad for me, sad for the life we had built that now lay in ruins. "When did it start?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now. She hesitated, as if weighing whether or not to tell me the truth. "It wasn't physical at first," she said. "It started with the lessons, the conversations. He would stay after sometimes and we'd talk about Emma, about life, about everything. And then it became texts, phone calls. I didn't think it was a big deal. I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. But it did," I said bitterly. She nodded, her tears falling freely now. "It did. And by the time I realized how far it had gone, I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to tell you. I was so ashamed, Alex. I still am." I stared at her, the woman I had loved for 15 years, and felt like I was seeing a stranger. "Did you love him?" I asked, the words choking in my throat. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. No, she said firmly.
No, Alex.
I swear to you it wasn't love. It was, I don't even know what it was. A distraction. A way to escape. But it wasn't love. Her words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made it worse. And what about Emma? I asked, my voice hardening. Did you think about her at all? Did you think about what this would do to her? She winced, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled over. I thought about her every day. And every day, I hated myself for what I was doing. But by then, I didn't know how to stop. I felt trapped in my own mistakes. I sat back, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, sadness, pity. All of it swirled inside me, overwhelming and chaotic. Do you regret it? I asked after a long silence. Her voice broke as she replied, more than anything. I would take it back if I could, Alex. I would give anything to undo the damage I've caused. I believed her. I could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of her guilt. But belief didn't equal forgiveness. I don't know if I can get past this, Caroline, I said, my voice raw. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. She nodded, her tears falling silently. I understand, she said softly. But I'll do whatever it takes to try. For you, for Emma, for us. Her words lingered in the air as I stood and walked away, leaving her at the table. I didn't know if I could forgive her. I didn't know if I even wanted to try. The days that followed felt like trudging through quicksand. Nothing about our lives resembled the comfort of normal anymore. Caroline and I lived like strangers sharing the same house, our interactions limited to what was necessary to keep the household running. The once familiar rhythm of our marriage, the small smiles exchanged over coffee, the quiet moments before bed, was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence that neither of us knew how to break. Emma was the only glue holding us together. She moved through the house cautiously, her eyes darting between Caroline and me like she was trying to gauge which one of us would crack first. She didn't ask any more questions about Daniel or the growing distance between us, but I could tell she felt it. The weight of our fractured family was a shadow over her. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office or scheduling unnecessary meetings to avoid coming home. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battleground, and every conversation with Caroline was a skirmish waiting to happen. Caroline, for her part, tried to make amends. She offered apologies at every turn, her voice raw with regret. She stopped texting or calling Daniel altogether, and I could see her making a conscious effort to be present for Emma. She even suggested counseling, something I never thought I'd hear her say. I want to fix this, Alex, she said one evening, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Please, let's try counseling. If not for us, then for Emma. I stared at her, torn between the anger that still simmered inside me and the faint, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. I'll think about it, I said, my voice cold. 2 weeks later, we sat in a cramped room with neutral-colored walls and a therapist named Dr. Miller. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that seemed designed to make people feel safe. Caroline and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us feeling like a chasm. Dr. Miller asked us to share why we were there, and Caroline spoke first. I made a mistake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I betrayed Alex, and I broke his trust. I've hurt him, and I don't know if he'll ever forgive me. But I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to fix this. I listened to her words, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. When it was my turn, I hesitated before speaking. I don't know if this is fixable, I admitted. I don't know if I can trust her again. But we have a daughter, and I owe it to her to try, for now. Dr. Miller nodded, her pen gliding across the notepad in her lap. Trust can be rebuilt, she said gently. But it's a process and it takes time. The question is, are both of you willing to put in that time? Caroline nodded immediately, her eyes pleading as she turned to me. I hesitated, the weight of her betrayal still heavy on my shoulders. But finally I nodded too. Counseling became a routine, a strange new addition to our lives. Some sessions were productive, peeling back the layers of our relationship and forcing us to confront things we had ignored for years. Other sessions felt like a waste of time, the anger and resentment too strong to make any real progress. Caroline opened up about feeling invisible, about losing herself in the roles of wife and mother. I listened, but it was hard to feel sympathy when the wound she had inflicted on me was still so fresh. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked during one session, my voice breaking. "If you were feeling like this, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you let me help you?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with regret. "I didn't know how," she said softly. "I was scared you wouldn't understand. And then, it just felt easier to keep it all inside." Her words hurt, but they also opened my eyes to my own shortcomings. I had been so focused on providing for our family, on being the stable, reliable husband and father, that I hadn't noticed Caroline slipping away. I had assumed she was fine because she never said otherwise. But understanding her feelings didn't erase the betrayal. Every time I thought about Daniel, the messages, the stolen moments, the lies, I felt a fresh wave of anger. Forgiveness felt like an impossible task. At home, things began to shift, slowly, painfully. Caroline was more attentive with Emma, making an effort to spend quality time with her. She volunteered at school events, helped Emma with her homework, and even joined her in practicing music. I stayed distant, keeping my interactions with Caroline civil but brief. The resentment lingered, a heavy presence in every room we shared. But I couldn't deny that she was trying. She was doing everything she could to prove that she was sorry, to prove that she was willing to change. One night, Emma approached me in the living room, her face serious. "Dad, are you and Mom going to be okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're trying." She nodded, her eyes searching mine. I want us to be a family again. I miss how things used to be." Her words hit me harder than anything Caroline had said. Emma was the one caught in the middle of this mess, and she was the one who would bear the weight of our choices. As the weeks turned into months, the cracks in our family didn't disappear, but they became less jagged. The tension in the house began to ease, though the memories of what had happened never strayed far from my mind. I found myself wondering what the new normal would look like. Would we ever get back to the way things were, or had too much damage been done? Was it possible to rebuild trust when it had been shattered so completely? The answers didn't come easily, and maybe they never would. But one thing was clear: the life we had before was gone. This was our reality now, a fragile, imperfect attempt at moving forward. It had been nearly a year since the night everything fell apart. A year of counseling sessions, strained conversations, and tentative steps toward rebuilding. A year of forcing myself to sit across from Caroline at the dinner table, to smile when Emma told a story about school, to act like I wasn't still bleeding from the wounds she had inflicted. But it wasn't all an act. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the pain began to dull. The anger that once consumed me started to burn out, leaving behind a kind of hollow acceptance. This was my life now. Not the one I had planned, but the one I had. Caroline had done everything she could to earn my forgiveness. She had cut Daniel out of her life completely, even switching Emma to a different vocal coach. She had thrown herself into therapy, both with me and on her own, trying to untangle the mess of emotions and choices that had led her to betray me. And I could see her trying, really trying, to make things right. But the question that haunted me, the one I couldn't seem to answer, was whether I wanted to let her. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself sitting on a park bench, watching the leaves fall from the trees. The air was cool, and the distant sound of children playing in the park mingled with the rustling of the wind. It was the kind of day that begged for reflection, and I had plenty to reflect on. I had agreed to give counseling a chance for Emma's sake, but deep down, I had known it wasn't just about her. Part of me had wanted to save our marriage, to believe that the life we had built could survive even this. But another part of me, one I was only now beginning to acknowledge, wondered if holding on was doing more harm than good. Caroline and I had made progress, but it was slow, uneven. Some days, I felt like we could find our way back to each other. Other days, the memory of her betrayal felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "Hey, Dad!" Emma's voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see her walking toward me, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail and a book tucked under her arm. She smiled as she sat down beside me, and for a moment, the sight of her made the rest of the world disappear. "What's up, sweetheart?" I asked, nudging her playfully. She shrugged, opening her book and flipping through the pages. "Nothing much. I just saw you sitting out here and thought you looked lonely." I laughed softly. "I'm never lonely when you're around." She smiled, but her expression grew serious after a moment. "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. Emma had always been perceptive, but the weight in her voice told me this wasn't just a casual question. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "You don't have to pretend, you know. Not with me." Her words hit me harder than she could have known. "It's complicated," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "Your mom and we're trying. But it's not easy." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her book. "I miss how things used to be," she said softly, "before all this. But I know it's not that simple." I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I miss it too, Emma. More than you know." That evening, I sat Caroline down for a conversation I had been avoiding for months. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice steady but firm. "And I've realized something." She looked at me, her face a mixture of hope and fear. "What is it?" "I don't hate you," I said, the words surprising even me. "I thought I did for a long time, but I don't. I understand why you did what you did, even if it doesn't excuse it. And I believe you're sorry. I believe you've been trying." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled back. "But that doesn't mean I can forget," I continued. "And it doesn't mean I can go back to the way things were. Too much has happened. The trust we had, it's gone. And I don't know if we can rebuild it." Her tears spilled over, and she covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. "Alex, please," she whispered. "Don't give up on us." "I'm not giving up," I said gently.
I'm letting go. Kropka.
The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. "This isn't just about me," I said, my voice breaking. "It's about Emma. She deserves a home where there's love and trust, not tension and resentment. And right now, I don't think I can give her that. Not like this." Caroline sobbed quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. "So what happens now?" "We move forward," I said. "Separately." The divorce was amicable as these things can be. We both agreed to prioritize Emma, to keep her life as stable as possible. Caroline moved into an apartment nearby, and we worked out a shared custody arrangement that allowed Emma to spend time with both of us. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I wondered if I had made the right choice. But there were also moments of clarity. Moments when I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders, when I could breathe again. Caroline and I remained civil, even friendly at times. The bitterness faded with time, replaced by a quiet acceptance of what we had lost. One evening, months later, Emma and I sat on the couch, flipping through old photo albums. She pointed to a picture of the three of us at the beach, laughing as the waves crashed around us. "Do you ever wish things could go back to the way they were?" she asked, her voice soft. I thought about her question, about everything we had been through. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But life doesn't work that way. We can't go back, Emma. We can only move forward." She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. "I think we'll be okay," she said after a moment. I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I know we will." And as I sat there with my daughter, I realized that she was right. We would be okay. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect, but we would find a new way to live, a new way to be a family. Because even in the face of heartbreak, there was still hope. And sometimes hope was enough. The end.